done. So I'm very pleased to be joined today on the call by Rama Venchard, who, very exciting, was awarded an MBE this year for his services to education, and I can certainly see why. Rama has an incredible dedication to governance and holds several governance positions at various levels of the school and trust structure. This includes being the chair of governors at Gesher School, which is an Ofsted outstanding all-through school that caters for pupils with a range of mild to moderate special educational needs. Now, we are hoping that we'll be joined shortly, if possible, by Adam Friel, who is the Head of Education Law at Geldards, and he has over 10 years experience and expertise in that specialist field, but we're not quite sure at the moment. I think Adam might be running a little bit late, so hopefully he'll be able to join the call shortly, but we will get started with Rama. Thank you. Oh, and I didn't even introduce myself, and I suppose I should. I'm Emma Hawker, and I'm the Impact and Training Manager at Governors for Schools, and I'll be talking to Rama and fielding some of those questions that we've got coming in. So Rama, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, I know we've got relatively limited time, so we'll jump right in. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about EHCPs, what they are, and why do they matter?
EHCPs, Education, Health and Care Plans, are allocated to children who have been assessed with a special educational need or disability. Those assessments are predominantly undertaken through the local authority and all their providers and their partners. It could be the NHS, it could be another provider. And part of the allocation of that plan is to be very specific about the needs of that child and how those needs need to be met. There are several sections in an EHCP. One of them is whereby a specific school is named for the child to attend. And as if by magic, Adam appears, who is far more qualified to explain what an EHCP is. I was just covering for you, Adam, there.
Thank you very much. Apologies. I was having issues with my PC at absolutely the wrong time. So basically, for those who don't know what an EHC plan is, it's like a legal contract of service between, suppose, a parent or a young person and a local authority regarding the services that local authority is going to provide. And typically in an EHC plan, well, legally, you have to have a description of a child's special educational needs, the provision that young child should receive from that school that has been named in section I. So when we talk about provision, it's got to be clearly specified and quantified in relation to what that child or young person should be receiving, and clear to everyone who is teaching that child exactly what the provision should be. And that can be environment, that can be therapies, it can be learning support assistance, it can be specialist teaching. The idea of an EHC plan is the needs dictate the provision, and the provision ultimately dictates the school which is named in section I. One of the problems, and I'm sure we're going to get to this in the discussion, is usually we find that EHC plans are limited on needs, very limited on provision, usually say something like band funding, which nobody knows what that means, and either render a school unable to meet needs because they don't have the right provision, or effectively because of the severity of a child's needs, they may require, for instance, a more specialist education, which can't be provided by a mainstream school and needs to be provided within a specialist school. And sometimes, even if a specialist school has been named, it can be the wrong one, because effectively, because the child's needs and provisions haven't been worked out properly, the wrong type of environment and school has been named. That's it in a very short snapshot, but I hope that gives a good indication.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. You've jumped into that so smoothly. That's brilliant. Do you be able to talk to us a little bit more about who puts the content into that document? So who is it that provides that expertise and gives that specification that you've talked about?
So the role of who runs an EHC plan is the local authorities. So they should be the ones writing up an EHC plan to reflect a child's needs and the provision they require. A lot of the time you tend to find that that happens in the first instance. So a local authority will produce the first draft, and that's usually based on the reports that a local authority collected during the original needs assessment. So the EHC needs assessment is a statutory assessment of working out exactly what a child's needs are, which then determines what should be provided in an EHC plan. So when we're talking about BF and I, that assessment is usually supposed to inform that. The problem about those reports is they're often quite vague, which means that the plan is quite limited sometimes over description of needs and provision. Often they don't specify and quantify the provision, which puts schools in quite a difficult position in terms of working out what they should be providing. That's if you're in a situation where the plan is fairly new. Often what happens is, say an EHC plan is issued in, say, year 7, and then it's not really updated or changed until, say, year 9. And usually at that stage, we do tend to find that a lot of local authorities push that obligation at amending that plan to kind of, I suppose, provide a current description of the child's needs and provision to the school and the school Senco. And it is a very laborious task to do. Technically, the plan should be amended every year when we have an annual review if the description of need and provision isn't appropriate. But you tend to find that local authorities don't amend on a yearly basis, and it's usually around phase transfers that you see that they will amend the plan, but it's usually relying on schools to do it for them. So the main kind of phase transfers you see is from primary to secondary, and from secondary to the post-16 placement.
Thank you so much, and that's really helpful. I just want to pick up, if that's okay, on a question that's come through in the chat, because it picks up on something that you mentioned. One of our questions is, can schools decline anyone with an EHCP if there is insufficient funding to provide for that individual?
Well, it depends on the type of school. So if we're looking at a maintained provision, so a mainstream school academy, or even a maintained special school, the school is asked a question about whether they can be named in the plan. With those types of schools, providing that they are suitable for the effective education of others, usually a school would be expected to take on that student. But the school can rightly say, we don't think we're appropriate for this child's special educational needs. We think a different type of setting or provision is required. But equally, if we were going to take on this child, we don't think that the level of provision outlined in the plan is enough, and we would require X amount of provision. Now, when that often happens, it's usually about secondary schools. So when secondary schools are asked whether they'll take a student, they're often shown plans which are woefully inadequate and outdated. And often secondary schools, after looking at the annual review reports, will have an idea about whether they can meet need. So schools can go back and say, we don't think we can meet this child's needs. But if the local authority were to name us, and we'd have serious reservations about that, we believe that we would require this amount of support, even just to accommodate this student. And even then we would have question marks over our ability to meet need long term. So I don't know if that answers the question, Emma. If it's an independent school, independent schools are entitled, unless they're signed up as a Section 41 school, which effectively gives their admission over to local authorities. In terms of independent schools, they're entitled to choose what students they think they can take on and whether they can effectively meet need before offering a place. As long as they haven't done anything discriminatory in their admissions process, they're entitled to say no, basically.
Just to add to that, in my experience, some state schools and or academies are directed by the local authorities to check a child. And that's either because the school has not been able to effectively put a case forward that they can't meet that child's need, which is normally the case, or typically the local authority just has nowhere else for that child to be placed within borough. But yeah, I know varying examples where the schools are directed to take the child.
That's quite right, and sometimes parents aren't even aware of that.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
A lot of the time a mainstream school will be named, for instance, in Section I of a plan, and the school itself have already written to the authority and said we cannot meet needs. And that information is not passed on to parents. And it's usually through things like subject access requests that we find that out during some of the appeals that I do, which obviously puts the local authority in a quite a difficult position at justifying their decision making. Reality-wise, we tend to find that many local authorities are not making decisions on the basis of need, which is the legal position. So when you're looking at a child's needs and provision, you've got to make your decisions based on what you think is right. Often these decisions are based on saving money rather than meeting needs. I should say, particularly with maintained provisions or academies, there is a parental preference. So if a parent asks for a particular school within the authority, usually the local authority must comply with that, unless that student's education at school would be incomparable with the education of others, or an unreasonable public expenditure. The latter very rarely comes in. With the incomparability, usually it's a situation where a local authority should be asking itself if what parents are asking can't be met, whether additional provisions can be put into place to accommodate that child. In most cases where you look at that, a local authority can accommodate a child. They just need to put more provision in place.
Fantastic, thank you, Adam. I think that's been really helpful. Lots of people really appreciating that in the Q&A. Thank you. So can we talk a little bit about tongue-tied now, sorry, ILPs and what this means and the language that people might be getting used to around this? So what are they? Why are they important?
Do you want me to jump in, Rama?
Yeah. And then I'll pick it up from a governance perspective.
So individual learning plans. So if we looked at I suppose the whole SEN framework, the general idea is that a child who has special educational needs, their needs can be met within the mainstream system. And the idea is if you identify a child with special educational needs, you should try and meet those needs within the classroom. If that child is not making progress, then you would usually refer the child to the Senco of the school. An individual ILP is put into place, and you basically try and address those needs within the school and resource. Now, every school in the country is effectively entitled to have its own SEN policy about how it escalates provision, which I think is something that the current government are looking to remove because it's too complicated to have every school in the country having a different system, which I probably could have told you in 2014. But the idea is with the IOP, you monitor and review a child's progress and you amend the provision accordingly. If a child is not making progress when you're monitoring and reviewing what they're doing, so the idea of plan, do and review, is that you escalate the provision. And that can be looking at additional resources within the school. It can be bringing in, say, therapists or access to, say, an educational psychologist at the school to do further assessments and update that IOP. Or it might be that situation where you've tried everything within your resources and really you need to look at making an application for an EHC plan. So the IOP is really important to demonstrate to everyone what you're doing to address a child's needs. It's also important to demonstrate when it's not going well, what you need to do as a school moving forward. So I think it's very important. But crucially, I say to schools all the time is often when there is a refusal to undertake a needs assessment, which is the statutory assessment, which leads to an EHC plan. Often local authorities say, well, you've not shown enough of the individual learning plans to justify us doing a needs assessment. Just to say that's nonsense, really. The legal test is whether it may be necessary to determine a child's special educational needs in an EHC plan. There are good cases where children should have that straight away because of the severity of the child's needs and shouldn't wait for those cycles of provision before it happens. I think that's a judgment for schools, but I always think it's important that schools have a good, robust SEN provision in place, which they are actually reviewing themselves. So it's great having individual learning plans, but if nobody's actually checking them properly, or I suppose feeling that you have to show progress when there isn't progress and they're not using them the proper way, then they're not kind of justifying the purpose. So I think it's important, if you have a good, robust system, that you're actually making sure that it's fit for purpose and it's demonstrating really whether you need to escalate the provision up and whether an EHC plan may be a better way of doing that.
ILP is also known as IEPs as well, individual education plans. From a governor, if I take it from another angle now, from a governor and trustee perspective, although the Senco of practice says governors should have access to EHC plans, it's unlikely that as a governor you'll need to read all the EHCPs of the children, whether your school is a mainstream or a special school, and you probably wouldn't read the IEPs, ILPs in detail. But what the governing body or the board should be asking from its executive team or its leadership team is, how is the school supporting children with SEND? Whether we have the appropriate trained resources and funding to support the relevant children, and whether we can meet their needs, and if not, why not? A couple of questions to ask the leadership team is whether, as part of the annual reviews, which Adam mentioned, which has to take place of these EHCPs, whether the children's needs are being met as per their plan. And then there's 2 follow-up questions. If they are being met, are they then achieving the expected outcomes, the expected progress? Because if not, what more needs to be done? The plan's probably not right. It probably needs to be reassessed. And then for those children whose needs are not being met, what are the reasons for those not being met, and what mitigating actions need to be put in place? So in summary, EHCPs and ILPs are very, very important for the child, but from a governor's perspective, they won't need to get into the detail. They will be reliant on their respective Sencos and the leadership team, but they need to be asking the right questions to get the right reassurance that the right support is being provided to the child.
And I would add to that, when you're looking at, say, the exclusion rates of a school or anyone who is being permanently excluded, whether that's happened, because I think if you look at the proportion of students who are excluded from mainstream schools and look into the actual detail, often they're being excluded because they're not being provided with the right provision. And then it comes again back to whether the individual learning plan is appropriate, or the EHC plan is adequate. And, you know, as Ron was saying, you're always looking at whether that child or young person is making expected progress. And going on expected progress, it's important to outline that it's not just attainment levels. When we're looking at children with special educational needs, it's about their cognitive profile, so that would be attainment. Then it's also looking at their attention and listening. It's also looking at their communication interaction, and looking at their social, emotional, and mental health, as well as their physical and sensory needs. So when we're looking at progress, if you're purely looking at academic attainment levels, then you're not going to see the full picture. And you can have, say, give an example, a very high functioning ASD student who on paper looks like they're a straight A student or a straight 9 student these days, isn't it? But actually they haven't been in school for a long time. They've been off school because they are sick, or they're constantly getting excluded because they're having altercations with other students. And instead of looking at excluding that student, really we should be looking at whether their provision in place is actually adequately addressing those needs.
Fantastic, thank you. Can I ask, as governors and trustees going into schools, if we're going in and we're having visits and conversations with school leaders, with Sencos, what else can we do? What other kind of questions can we ask to ensure that those processes are really robust and that we know that things are being, that provision is really effective?
If they are a link governor for SEND, the key person they'll be liaising with would be the Senco, the SEN coordinator. And effectively, the link governor's role is to monitor the arrangements that affect children with SEND. So they'll be they'll need to seek reassurance on how their needs are being met. They need to play that back to their governing body or their board of trustees. Funding, SEND funding, depending on the EHC plan, it will determine whether some children come with additional funding, one-to-one support, for example. So is that funding really being used effectively to support that child? Should be one of the questions that are being asked. The link governor needs to meet, ideally needs to meet the Senco at least termly. And then from a governing body's perspective, to get in terms of a triangulation of feedback, you should ask for the outcomes of these children from the leadership team, from the head teacher, a view from the link send governor, and any other external reviews that have been undertaken, whether it's the annual reviews that have been done on the plans or any other third party that you come in to do a send assessment in the school. And I think whenever decisions are made by a governing body or by a board of trustees, the board should always ask how these decisions will impact children with SEND. So, because sometimes it will, and it's not never. Sometimes it's really a thought process. So if they constantly say, okay, these are the decisions we're making because blah, 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 how does it impact our children with SEND? Because then they may need to tweak some of their recommendations.
And I think that comes down to senior management as well. So when you think about what Ofsted are looking at in terms of senior management and I suppose the values and outcomes for children with special educational needs, that's really important. Something which I always find quite frustrating is how some schools see the Senco's role as quite a hindrance, really, or they don't take it seriously. As far as I'm concerned, a Senco's role in the school is one of the most important cogs in ensuring that a school works and works well. And I think there needs to be greater understanding by schools about how important that role is, particularly not only for the school to function, but also to ensure that we are achieving the best possible outcomes for children with special educational needs. I think depending on the school, you can really tell whether the culture of that school really supports needs by how the Senco within that school is treated and what their role really is within the school itself.
The other thing that governors should be asking their senior leaders is how the school and the Senco, for that matter, is able to support parents, because it's the parents, unfortunately, who are the ones who have to get pushed for their child to be assessed or reassessed, for that matter. And sometimes they just don't know the protocols or the processes to do so. So they need support and guidance. So I think that's a role, unfortunately, it's a role for the school to signpost them if necessary or when necessary, when they're struggling to get their child assessed for a plan, or signpost them to any other sort of local authority available support and guidance.
Fantastic, thank you. That leads me nicely onto a question where someone has asked about whether you could talk any more about parental involvement. And someone recently had to investigate a complaint in this area for another school, which had cited poor governance. Is there anything that you think governors can do to kind of make sure that parents are being supported in the right way?
It's that bit about asking the leadership team about the annual reviews and making sure whether again, as Adam mentioned earlier on, sometimes when these plans are drafted, it's drafted on the basis of how the child presents their systems on literally within an hour of how they're being assessed, where sometimes they have underlying needs which aren't presented until they actually come to school. And unless they have those regular, effective annual reviews, their needs won't be properly identified and won't be properly met. So that's how we can support parents. We should be supporting parents by, as governors, challenging to make sure these annual reviews are taking place effectively, and whether the needs can or can't be met by the school. If they can't be met by the school, this is where we have to be robust as an educational setting with the local authority and in support of the parents to make sure the child gets the right provision. Now, that's easily said than done. Oh my God, that's so easy said than done, because it can take ages, years sometimes, for a child to be placed in an appropriate setting for their needs. But you can't not do it just because it's going to be hard. And that's where parents, I believe, need the support of schools, because they're the closest they're going to have in terms of relationship than they would have with the local authority directly.
I think to add to that, it's also just the school having some empathy for what the parent is going through. Obviously I'm a lawyer. I've been doing this area of law for many years, but I also have my own son who's got special educational needs. I think when we were going through that journey of understanding what his needs were and what provision was required for him, it's a very anxiety-provoking time, because obviously you're sitting there thinking, where is my child's future in terms of their education? Are they in the right setting? Am I really being supported? I think to add to that, you're going to have a lot of parents who may share the same needs as their children who are undiagnosed. So I think having empathy about that and having clear communication is really important. And also signposting parents to who within a school they should be going to. So is it the class teacher that if a parent has some concerns about the educational provision their child is receiving, they should go to? Is it directly to the Senco? Who is the best person to go to? I think having those clear lines of communication is really important, and also clear lines of who will be responding to certain situations. And depending obviously on the urgency of the situation, about the kind of expectation of how quickly the school can respond to a parent about a certain issue. I know that schools really struggle to keep their communication up with parents because they're dealing with lots of children with special educational needs and also doing their day-to-day teaching and running of a school. But I think once you've lost a parent's trust with a child needs, they very rarely ask again, and it can really impact on the child's progress within that school, and also the school's ability to meet needs. So I always think it's really important to recognize the journey a parent is going through, to empathize with the experience that they're going through, and also to have clear guidance and communication routes. Communication is everything, but it's often too slow for parents, and there's not enough guidance on what the school are going to do in situations where, say, a child's needs have been identified or people have concerns about what's going to happen next.
Thank you both. That's a really helpful insight into what we as governors need to be aware of about a kind of stakeholder group and how their experiences factor into all of this. Thank you. I've had lots of comments in the Q&A about a big delay in EHCPs and people wondering what's going on and why that's happening. And we've, people might have seen some things in the media at the moment about EHCPs and targets and that kind of thing. And we've got a question: should we be challenging the number of EHCPs and ILPs? Adam, I'm going to you first.
It's a really interesting one, and from my point of view, it's generally a misunderstanding of the situation. So we hear a lot about there being a significant portion of EHC plans being produced, more than there ever has before. And the general idea with a lot of things that you read in the papers or stuff coming from local authorities is there's a lot of children who don't need EHC plans. So to take you back to when the Children and Families Act came in 2014, originally a statement, which was a predecessor, went up to 18. And that's if you stayed within a school. If you went into a college, effectively the statement would cease to be maintained straight away. So the proportion of people entitled to EHC plans was much less than it is now. Now EHC plans go to 25. So technically you've doubled the population of people who are potentially entitled to them. Add to all of that, I think parents themselves and schools are getting better at understanding children with special educational needs and recognizing that the school itself may not be able to meet those needs. So it's not a question that there's too many EHC plans. It's actually that this is an area of law and an actual an area where, say, the population is double what it used to be. But the funding towards EHC plans, I think if you looked at it year on year, hasn't necessarily gone up since about 2010 substantially. And we're obviously in 2023 now. So we've got more people than ever really being able to understand their needs and what's required for their children. We've got double the amount of potential people who are entitled to it. So I think we're asking the wrong question. It's not so much let's cut down EHC plans and challenge that. I think it's more of a question of we need to push for that these things are properly funded. To add to that, it might be that there are students out there who may not have required EHC plans if the provision within schools had been adequately put in place through ILPs in the first place, and schools were appropriately resourced. So it's a chicken and egg one, that, but I tend to find that early intervention is key.
Yeah.
If you put provision in early, you usually get better outcomes. But if you go years without proper provision being put into place, you inevitably end up at an EHC plan and in circumstances where you may have avoided it because that child has been unable to make expected progress, and the attainment gap between them and their peers has increased significantly. So yeah, I would always ebb on the side of caution when you hear tales that there's too many EHC plans, or somehow parents are unreasonably wrestling local authorities out of funding. Local authorities are big organizations. They do know their legal obligations. They do understand what they should be providing, but often instead of looking at need and provision, they often look at protecting their spend, which generally means that less students are getting the support they should for longer than necessary.
And some of the reasons behind the delays in EHCPs being raised again is because of that spending, that funding, the caseloads within the relevant local authorities are just too long, and it goes beyond the 20-week statutory limit that whereby they should be assigning one. The other issue, I completely agree about the early intervention, and I think this is where we as an education sector schools to provide that expertise at an earlier stage to possibly diagnose and assess the children. There's a few schools which I know of who are able to do diagnosis of dyslexia, dyspraxia, and autism to a degree, not a full ed psych type assessment. And if they can do that at an earlier stage and put in those interventions and those individual education plans before they get worse, in a sense, before they have a need for a proper plan, before they have a need to be placed in a special school, that would add so much to that child's life and not deny them of the opportunity to progress as they should do. But it's not all down to money. I think it's a little bit down to money, but a little bit down to the structure and how we run our schools, how we assess our children.
Yeah, I'd agree with the majority of what you just said there, Rama. I think to add to that, there is that other side where sometimes there's a student within a class that I think most schools would recognize should be within a more specialist setting. And I think schools can sometimes find it really difficult to have that conversation with the parents of that child involved, which then leads to that child probably going for longer than necessary in terms of not getting the right provision, which actually worsens the situation. I think, again, it comes down to that communication when you have the other side, which is you might have a parent saying, I think my child's needs are greater than I was being recognised. If you could see the kind of issues I'm having at home in terms of, I suppose, meltdowns after school, I feel like something's not quite right here. I often find there's situations where that child might seem absolutely fine in class, and so that parent's views is dismissed as being kind of, I suppose, a pushy parent or a parent who's too anxious about a situation, rather than really looking under the surface of that. Usually, for instance, with those cases, it can be years before anyone does anything, and by the time they do, there's been a kind of breakdown of placement due to mental health issues. So I think having good communication, taking parents seriously when issues are raised is, really important as well.
I know of a couple of secondary schools where they've purposefully gone through the process to permanently exclude a child, because that was the only way within their local authority to get that child given a placement in a special school. They wouldn't consider a managed move or a proper assessment. Because once the child's permanently excluded, the local authority has a statutory duty to provide an alternative setting an alternative provision. And you kind of think that's not fair. That child's history is tarnished now for being, for being permanently excluded. Anyway.
I think that demonstrates very nicely how important it is that we as governors do our job and make sure that we are providing that effective challenge and really monitoring things so that we can sort of try and help make sure that provision is as effective as possible and support where we can before any issues get bigger and escalate. Thank you. Do you have another question? Will Ofsted need governors to know about EHCPs and ILPs or IEPs or whatever terminology you use at your school specifically?
No, they won't need the governors to know the exact detail. They will need to know the percentage of children we've sent. They'll need to know how the school approaches dealing with children with EHCPs, the bits we talked about earlier on, in terms of how can they confirm whether their needs have been properly assessed, are being properly met, their expected progress is being achieved, and any issues impairing that are being addressed. The questions would be, I think I wrote down, are pupils with SEN progressing as well as other pupils with SEN nationally? So that would be a definite question Ofsted would ask, so they need to be prepared to respond to that. How is SEN funding being monitored? And how is the board holding the school to account for its spending? How does the school keep the SEN policies up to date and compliant? How does the board verify the accuracy of what the head teacher is telling you? Hence that triangulation of information and data. How are the needs of the pupils with SEN addressed within the school improvement plan? So every school will have a school development plan or school improvement plan. There should be a specific area for meeting the needs of children with SEN. And then ensuring that these questions are holding the senior leaders to account and their responses are accurately recorded in the minutes of the governing body meeting, because that's another source of information that the Ofsted inspectors will go to see whether the debate on SEN is effectively taking place at a school. So it's a range of those questions. They don't need to know the specifics of the plans, the ILPs or the EHCPs, but they'll need to know how the funding is working, how they're addressing needs, etc.
I mean, I take it from a different point of view, because I think what Rama said there kind of covers what Ofsted would be looking at in terms of the overall game plan from a school over how they are meeting, addressing needs and ensuring that they spend appropriately. With the cases that I'm involved with, I'm usually assisting parents with SEN appeals to SEN tribunal and representing. That's where, say, a tribunal would go into far more detail about an individual case and what a school has been providing for that child, and whether ultimately that provision or what that child requires can be provided within that setting. I often have head teachers turn up to tribunal, and the first thing they say is, well, we've got an Ofsted outstanding, so therefore, we're a very good school. And often there's a misunderstanding that whilst that might show and demonstrate overall that the school have a good plan, it doesn't show what that school is doing for that individual child. So I think it's important that when governors are looking at children with special educational needs at their school, if there is any kind of statistics being provided within the school about students who are not meeting expected progress, to really question why that's the case. Equally, if you see statistics coming through from the school that says everyone's improving and making expected progress, you should really start to challenge that, because children develop in different ways, and I wouldn't be expecting every child to be making magic amounts of progress every year. So I think it's being kind of forensic about what you're looking at, and not just accepting it on face value.
Fantastic, thank you. Definitely one of the important parts of our monitoring role, to make sure that we're really seeking those assurances where we need them. Thank you. Right, I know we're getting towards the end of our time, but I think we can sneak in one more question. Should we be asking our Senco if they have enough time allocated to this important role, especially in small schools where people have to wear many hats? What would you say to that, Rama?
Well, definitely, as Adam mentioned right at the beginning, some schools, the Senco role isn't as which isn't as revered as it should be, effectively, and therefore yes, and that is their key role. Again, different parts of the country have different levels of send, so that needs to be a key focus for the leadership team and the governing body to ensure the Senco has the bandwidth, the capacity, and the skill set as well to deal with the level of send cases that they're responsible for. Some schools, the Senco blends their role with other safeguarding roles, which isn't a bad thing, but as long as that doesn't inhibit their ability to truly operate as a Senco. But yes, it is important to, as the Senlink governor's role should be assessing whether the Senco does have the appropriate time, skill sets, resources to do what they need to achieve.
I mean, from my point of view, I'm more and more coming to the conclusion that a Senco shouldn't really be doing direct teaching in terms of having their own, say, class. Obviously, they should be doing the intervention, but I think the role done properly of a Senco these days involves such a high level of paperwork when dealing with local authorities, such a high level of involvement with class teachers, that it's very hard for it to be part-time and give your time to that. If any governor here has seen how long it takes, say, a Senco just to make an EHC needs assessment, it is so time consuming. And the same goes for arranging annual reviews, reviewing ILPs. I think we've got to get away from the idea that a Senco is almost a side job. It should be the main role of that person. And I don't think we can be realistic anymore about ensuring the best possible outcomes for students with special educational needs if that role is done ad hoc as a kind of backup rather than a main role. Again, I spoke at the beginning about, the amount of respect which goes for Sencos as well. The biggest thing I get back from most Sencos is they feel quite unsupported within their schools. They feel that they have lots of conflicting information about what they should be doing, what their legal duties are, and what they should be kind of doing when it comes to kids with special educational needs. And that can come down to poor training in terms of what's coming in, I suppose, from local authorities. It can be internally within the school. But I find it very surprising, particularly with my tribunal work, when you really kind of push a Senco of a school over what their role is and what they understand in terms of the legal duties of a local authority over an EHC plan, how limited that understanding is in a lot of cases. And it's not that that person isn't good at their kind of day-to-day running. It's just that they're getting a lot of misinformation. I'd say that there is quite a lot of gaslighting happening by local authorities on Sencos to think that say the funding is what it is and there's no change to that. It doesn't matter the child has an EHC plan, they will only allocate a particular amount of funding. Again, it's that kind of information which I think leads a Senco to think that they're in a hopeless situation where there are odds with the school, but also odds with the local authority as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Adam. I know that we could talk much longer about this. It's such an interesting topic, but we do need to draw our session to a close. But I think that's definitely an important point to finish on. We've got to take care of our Sencos. A huge thank you to you, Rama and Adam. Really, really helpful insights there. I've got lots and lots of questions now that I want to go away and think about for my role as a governor. And questions I'd like to have with people. And I love the idea that everything we look at, I must think about how is this going to look for our pupils that have those special needs. Thank you.